When you create a grid layout using the grid template columns and the grid template rows properties, you are defining what is called the explicit grid. For instance, if you define 3 column tracks and 2 row tracks, you are defining an explicit grid that has 3 columns and 2 rows. Now, what happens if you add new items to your grid? You can see by default your browser will create new rows, and the size of the row is set to auto. That's because the size of these rows has not been set using the grid template rows property. But you can use the grid auto columns or the grid auto rows to set the size of any auto generated grid tracks, also called implicit grid tracks. So for instance, if we go to our container and here we type in grid auto rows and set a value of 400 pixels, now all rows that are in the implicit grid have a size of 400 pixels. But if you remove these grid items, this property will have no effect. That's because you don't have any grid item that is in the implicit grid. Let's add them back and set another value for these rows. Now, by default, when you have new items that you don't explicitly place on the grid, the auto placement algorithm kicks in to automatically place items. You can control how it works using the grid auto flow property. The default value for this property is row, which tells the auto placement algorithm to fill in each row, adding new rows as necessary. But if you set this property to column, now the auto placement algorithm will add new columns when there are new grid items in the implicit grid. And you can control the size of these tracks using the grid auto columns. So if we set grid auto columns to 100 pixels, now any new grid item that is in the implicit grid will be placed by adding new columns. That's because we have set the grid auto flow to column and has a size of 100 pixels. That's because we set the grid auto columns property to 100 pixels. The grid auto flow property accepts another value that is the dense value. This value will tell the auto placement algorithm to attempt to fill in holes earlier in the grid if smaller items come up. And you can use it by setting a value of row dense, which will create the following result, or the value of column dense, which will create the following result. And there is also an important aspect that you need to remember. When using the dense value, this may cause your elements to appear out of order.